so much. I want to wish you all a very good morning, and I'm really delighted to be invited in to open our conversation today as we can kind of look at unpacking meaning, maybe bringing some insight, bringing some personhood back into materiality, specifically within medical collections. A few caveats. I am a bit of an outsider here. I'm a historian, although I think I'm an anthropologist if you push me after a few drinks. I'm an academic at an Irish university, UCD, as I'll refer to it, University College Dublin. I'm a non-museum practitioner in spite of being quite friendly and hoping to be more involved with the Hunterian Museum, which I've been working with since COVID, and finally went there yesterday for my first time, and absolutely delighted. So I want to offer you instead kind of my own perspective as this outsider, as someone who the closest I usually get to medical collections is the flavor of my whiskey that I like with that kind of bandage kind of scent to it. And instead I want to offer you my perspective as a global historian. And so kind of recruit maybe you toward this way of being, at least for the next 40 minutes or so, and really invite us all to learn from each other. All of our own individual specialties that we have, our own perspectives, are really important. And I think it's really great if we can bring them all together. So I want to try my best to bring them together, maybe help us learn from these different disciplinary backgrounds that we have, kind of clash through some of our boundaries, and share best practice. So I'm going to share some stories. I'm going to share some ideas from people that I've learned from, groups that I've learned from in that way. I don't speak for these groups. We shouldn't speak. They're quite capable of speaking for themselves. But instead, I want to kind of, bring on these ideas in its plural, right? So not silencing anything, but bringing it together, not talking over, but talking with in that sense. If you were to come to UCD and do an MA degree with me in global history, you would hear me drone on and on that global history is not a real thing. In spite of it being my background, in spite of it being my job title, you can't be a global historian. That's too big. That's too vast, right? It's spreading too much butter over too much toast in that sense, right? Instead, global history is a methodology. Global history is a way of practicing what we do. It's a toolkit. And so I want to offer us kind of some of these tools that I've used in global history to kind of bring together these various studies towards the inherited collections that we might have in medical museums. I want to paraphrase the late and great Christopher Bailey. Everybody who's late is always great, but he truly was great, who in one of his books said, "We're all global historians now, even though very few of us realize it yet." And that's what I want to invite all of you to be as global historians with me, at least for this few moments. So we start with the globe. So I picked this image for you. This is the Earth taken from space. This is not typically how we would view the Earth, and in this way maybe we're challenging ourselves to already begin shifting our perspectives. Here quite literally, but also looking at some of the masked, the hidden, the invisible, sometimes intentionally obscured stories that we'll hear about in panels 1 and 5, pasts that we'll hear about in panel 2, voices that we'll hear about in panel 3, narratives that we'll hear about in panel 4. I've taken all of these from the titles today as we go through the program. And so I give us this image, right? It shows us the Earth as an incredibly vast space, right? This is the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean is sort of a study in isolation. It's here at the very center of our globe that we see the most isolated point on Earth. This is a point that's so far away from other landmass that usually, this is the famous adage of the area, it's called Point Nemo. The closest humans are occasionally the International Space Station that passes overhead, right? So the vastness that we have. But it's also a web of connections that we see. I think thinking oceanic, for me, especially some of my case studies are going to be from Oceania, bringing these ideas together are studies of collaboration, of integration at that sense. I also wanted to use this map because it's a bottom-up perspective of the Earth. It's giving us these new ideas to think about things. There we go. So another map for you, an actually slightly grainy and blurred map instead, but here a bottom-up perspective as well, right? So all of my maps today are not going to be helpful for you. They're not meant to be in that sense. We're not learning in that regard. We're learning perspectives. We're learning ideas. So here we center Antarctica, right? The landmass with no permanent population. The population of penguins in that sense. I realize I've used one that uses French language, a global language, a colonial language in that sense, although English would be just the same in that way. So this is the continents at different shapes for us, right? We're quite used to learning on the Metaker map, right, a map 500 years old, really great for oceanic travel, really bad for the space and size of things, right? This is why Trump wants Greenland, right? It's massive on the map. If we actually see the size of the continents, although this one does obscure them as well, we can shrink, we can change things, right? We can change our perspectives in that sense, see the world through numerous different ways. Again, trying to think in the plural in that way. So if I can go back, now I'll go forward instead of going back. If I can go back to my first slide, this is what I want to try to do with this talk, is these plural practices, right? So this is why I've called it this quite long-winded kind of title of really looking at these decolonizing, these rehumanizing methodologies. Methodologies is all that I can offer. It's up to us to put them into practice at this point. We can kind of embrace this kind of shifting of perspective if we look away from the traditional centers, right, or create new centers in that way, right? There's no periphery or center. It depends on where you're pointing your lens or placing your magnifying glass at that way, right? So European histories, American histories allow us to consider the alternative histories of Oceania, of Africa, of South America, of the Middle East or Near East, depending on where you are again in your perspective. Right? Not instead of, but alongside of our studies that we do in Scotland, for instance. And so one of the first things that I'll teach my students, not that any of you are my students, is that the opposite of global is never local, right? We tend to think of these things as counterpoints to each other. The opposite is national. The opposite of global is national. Local has much more in common with global. Global is too big, it's too ethereal. Local is real, it's hyper-specific. So my argument today is the local is what actualizes the global for us in that sense. I'm all too aware of our interconnected webs of the world, right? These lines can represent webs. In spite of maybe hopefully being mistaken as a Canadian this morning, I am not. I'm an American. I'm all too familiar with what happens when isolation nationalists resurge themselves and change the world in different ways. In that sense, right? So I'm guided instead by historians or anthropologists like David Graeber, who sees this world as being us in the plural, right? We're all products of endless entanglement. We need to stop situating ourselves as the center and seeing the global kind of framing around us. Instead, we need to reinvent our centers in this way, looking toward the periphery as its own center. Right, and so these are those kind of entanglements that I want to give us as we think about global, as we think about local, as we think about our curatorial practices, our research, our engagement, and our very own ways of identifying and ways of being. Can we learn from different alternative, but no less important ways of being, systems of knowledge, ways of identifying themselves? So some case studies for us, right? Again, an unhelpful map for us. Sápmi, right? The traditional homeland of the Sámi people, the indigenous people of the Nordic north for us, based on our perspectives. There's the Sámi flag for you. This is an aspirational flag. They don't have a territory in this sense, right? There's national boundaries that cut through this. It's quite big. It's a place to imagine these overlays. In that sense, right? This is plurality in its making, and that's why I wanted to choose it as kind of our first study in that sense. So it's a landmass that goes over Norway, goes over Sweden, goes over Finland, goes over Russia, right? These are countries that are constantly voted as the highest in the global index. Happiness, not Russia, sorry, but constantly the happiness quota. It just came out recently, but of course not happy for everyone, right? Who you are depends on how you're treated in that sense. And so the Sápmi are kind of often ignored. During the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when Finland was joining, or when all the Nordics were joining NATO, one of the things they started doing was practicing bombing in the north area, because they said these are empty lands, right? They're not empty lands, that's the Sápmi lands, right? So we're again carrying on these kind of ideas as we go forward and thinking about invisibility. And I want to try to make these things visible in that sense. And I'm not alone. So I'm learning from different museums. There's a museum in Tromsø up in the very top part of Norway. It's called the Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum, right? So art museum in that sense. And in 2017, they chose to make themselves invisible. So the museum disappeared overnight. This was a few months in planning. They didn't announce anything. One day they just closed. The next morning they opened up as the Sápmi Data Musei, right? So the Sápmi Art Museum. Using the Sápmi language to redo it. Right? No press release, just suddenly happens one morning. The director of the museum called that move an anti-museum project, right? Seeking to decenter his very being, in that sense, seeking to decenter the space. And instead they put out press releases in the Sápmi language. They used Sápmi ways of communicating with each other to bring in this new museum. All of the signage is stripped away from Norwegian, or at least relegated to the smaller text. Sápmi language instead becomes the big things. The gift shop changes, right? The items within the gift shop are changed. Social media profiles change, right? This is a digital space. Digital spaces allow us to pivot quite quickly. And so the museum, again, it's a temporary space. The museum didn't go away. The Norse Museum comes back 2 months later as the permanent building. But it existed for 2 months as a placeholder, as a chance to revitalize a new presence in that way. The museum is incredibly rewarded for this. Their numbers go up incredibly high, their visiting numbers. Now again, this is in the Arctic. The numbers aren't huge that we're talking about, but it is important that this wasn't a misstep, right? It wasn't a miscalculation. It was a chance to kind of identify a problem, seek to address it in that way. It's not without co-option, it's not without certain problematic elements, but it's a really interesting way of a new paradigm of which we can switch these things, right? And this was part of a larger project that Norway and Sweden, so there's a transnational kind of connection. Norway and Sweden were working on this. This is called the Recalling Ancestral Voices. I really love that term, recalling them, right? It has an oral kind of idea. The Sápmi traditions are orally transmitted, as often is the case with many indigenous cultures. And this is one that kind of puts action behind the words as well. So as part of a larger project starting in 2022, so a few years after the disappearance and reappearance of the museum, Sweden returns 18 Sápmi human remains back to Sápmi, back to the traditional homelands. Finland finds 2,200 objects, returns it to the Sápmi Museum. They have their own museum in Finland, right? It's a place for them to display their ideas. A lot of these ideas are written in this very good book that you can follow along on yourself. So again, I'm learning from the elders that are teaching me in this way, right? I'm not actually learning from a Sápmi person. The author of this isn't Sápmi, but it's a chance for me to engage it in English. I don't fully speak these languages, right? I try to use the languages when I can, but I need some sort of access, right? So they're meeting me more than halfway. The product of this talk is hopefully that by the end of it, we'll be meeting people more than halfway, right? It's on us to meet them in that sense. And so the Sápmi are constantly trying to respond to the present challenges of their way of life. This is where climate change is felt, in one of the most real ways. It's where settler colonialism still continues to activate. It's where invisibility happens, right, as they're kind of relegated to different ideas. And so the museum guidelines are constantly fluid in this way, right? It's a way of reimagining how they belong, a place for them to kind of reinvent themselves or relearn. And so they have really interesting terminology that they have it, right? So they see their museum guided under motat. Motat means remembering, really great kind of word, right? Returning the Sápmi ways, the Sápmi practices back to their museum to speak out against that erased culture. in that sense, right? So it was remembered, it was forgotten, or it was obscured, or it was silenced. Now it's being remembered in that sense, right? The museum is that space to activate these Sápmi cosmologies, these oral traditions, as much as the materials, right? The materials allow them to speak, the materials are important, but it's not the full story, right? It's the activation of those, giving voice to these objects in that sense. We can connect this latitudinally. Again, very unhelpful map for you as well. These are all intentional, although Canada being on there, I did steal all of these online, I should point out. So this is Hatigawai. So Hatigawai is a museum located in what they would call Turtle Island. Turtle Island stands in for North America. It can also stand in for the entire globe. It's intentionally meant to be this kind of evocative way of imagining the world, way of imagining connections. So it's an island chain. It's about 150 islands, not all of them populated. This is off the west coast of Canada, just above Vancouver. Canada has over 277 Indigenous First Nation communities, or First Nations in that sense. So the Hatigawai are just one of this, right? And again, we want to be careful that we're not thinking monoculture. Within Hatigawai, the Hadi would have different ideas of how they see themselves in that way, right? So we can't speak, when we're talking plural, we need to factor that even more to additional pluralities in that sense. So Hatigawai, like many coastal communities in this area, it's a space known for using protective totem poles. Many of these totem poles can be found in European museums. We probably all haven't been to Hatigawai, but we've probably seen Hatigawai materials. They have a deep connection, and in fact a really positive now relationship with UK museums in that sense. They've been brought in as partners because of that, or through that, it's flustered as they're coming over to return their possessions back home. And they have a really interesting kind of way of seeing things. I realize that the slide has been cut off there. Sorry about that. But this is the Hatigawai Museum. They call it the Salindane, which means the savings house things. According to the museum director, Jisong, or she uses her English name, Nika Coulson, Sadalingnai is, quote, the result of one of the earliest acts of making things right, right? So using that term of reconciliation, but a different spin on it, right? It's not reconciliation, it's making things right, acknowledging the past trauma in the museum world, right? It's a vision of both the Hadi citizens, our Canadian friends that are residing on all of our islands, of all islands, right? Thinking about Turtle Island in that way. A place of being, the museum opened in 1976, so these things have both recent and deeper past, depending on where we're putting our metric in that way. And in 2017, they opened up a heritage center that's attached to this museum, right, to allow this museum to be an active, real, animated place. In that sense, right? So the museum director says this is a place for our people, but a place for us to share our culture. This is our gift to the world in that way. So it's offering us a new museum paradigm. This is one of few slides that have a ton of text. I don't expect you to read all of the text. I'll leave it up here as I talk over it. But it's offering us this new way of seeing things, right? The savings things house is this really illustrative example of that, right? One of the gifts that it's giving us are handbooks. So they're writing their own museum curatorial practices. They're publishing these. They're sharing them. You can find them online. You can find them in talks that they're giving. Showing us this new way that we can be thinking about equal plural partnerships as we go through it. So the Hatigawai Museum, in its very founding and opening, it's set on this idea of making things right, of quote, two worlds coming together for the betterment of all, and that's united by Hadi ideology called Yadagingnan. And Yadagingnan means the act of paying respect. Which is kind of this long-standing idea of mutually beneficial relationships, right? It's all about relationship formation, where belongings are visited, they're brought back to life within the museum space, right? So Yadagingnan, more commonly kind of known as repatriation, is based on mutual respect, cooperation, trust. Right? It's bringing new depth to this nation, it's bringing healing, and it's bringing the ability for them to heal others, right? Learning from their past, sharing their past in that sense. It's an opportunity, it's an invitation for what we would call Western museums to really become these voluntary agents of change, right? Rather than thinking about them as placeholders of physical evidence of past trauma in that way. So it allows us to think about some of the forms that these objects can take beyond the bureaucratic and the legal snares. And so one of the ways that they do it in Hadi culture is by calling it, by thinking in strings, right? So string theory, but not the kind that we would know in that way, right? And so they think about it using this perspective, right? So this is another quote. We do everything that we do because we know it's connected to the past. This is a practice called putting a string on someone. For example, during times of arranged marriage, one family of one child might endow a great deal to another family, effectively putting a string on them, ensuring that the two are tied together and are moving forward as one. Our ancestors put a string on their treasures. Our ancestors put a string on themselves. Our ancestors put a string on the museums that they were taken to and that they belong to us. We're bound together. We're transcended through Hadi history, through culture, through identity, binding these two worlds so that we can come together into a future when the time is right to heal and redefine our relationships as we move forward. So we can pull on these strings, right? They can pull on the strings and bring people home. Bring these museums home. Left uninterrupted, right, museums often can accidentally or intentionally or just passively continue colonial gazes in many ways. So this is a chance to disrupt that, right, and a chance to kind of move forward. And one of the things I really appreciate about the way that their museum is working this is it's almost like a loaning library in that sense, right? Things can be moved in and moved out of this, all right? To quote from the slide, right, we're not thinking about long-term loans the way Western museums might think about loaning ideas. Instead, we're thinking about loaning it out to the community itself, right? There's no kind of signs that are put up that it says, temporary off exhibit. Instead, it's a way for ceremony, right? It's not an apology, it's an active presence in that sense, right? Animating their objects, showing their culture, practicing their culture in that sense. Let's move away. Another map for us, inverted. This is the continent of Africa, right, in all of its many complexities, right, imagining kind of, this is an aspirational map. It's imagining a pre-colonial area of belonging, not by these arbitrary and imperial imposed boundaries, but instead different ways of being, right? So different identities. I appreciate it's quite small to see. This is imagining if the Black Death had wiped out all of Europe. Right? If there had been no Reconquista, if there had been no Berlin Conference, how Africa might have come together as a series of collected Islamic states, localized kingdoms, different federations, united around language groups perhaps, or ethnic being not imposed upon, but self-actualized in that way. It's also a problematic map. This is a cartography of imagination. This is not African intellectuals telling us their history. This is a Swedish graphic designer who made this map. He sells it on his website. You can buy it and pin it on your wall. I'm waiting for him to make one of the Sápmi homeland using different languages and how we have it. So again, we're not thinking about Africa as a country. We're thinking about Africa as a plural place, as a continent in its true sense that extends beyond its own borders. That's why I like this one. It slips into what we would see as the global north there on the south for us, right? It's a place of 54 countries in this landmass that's so incredibly vast. Africa's about 20% of the world in terms of landmass. You can fit the United States and China and India and the US and all of Europe and Japan all inside of it, all at the same time, right? So truly a vast space. I don't have time or the ability. I'm not a global historian in that way. I can't learn all of these cultures. I have to pick and choose. And so I picked one for us. Many of you might be familiar with it from Kenya. This is the Invisible Inventories Project, started in 2021. All these really great projects started right during COVID, allowing us to maybe actually come together on online spaces. This is a collaboration between National Museums Kenya and 2 German museums, making visible the absence of Kenyan cultural heritage. And so in reflecting on this, people have talked about it as moving beyond restitution, right? It's not just about the return of these objects, although they quite like all of these objects back, but it's about acknowledging that these objects aren't there anymore. So they have a few different exhibits that they put up. Again, it's a reminder of that these histories are reshaped through violence, they're reshaped through loss, but they're also reshaped through voids, right, through the invisible voids, and making that invisible visible in that sense as we collect this research. So they've put out a digital database. This digital database is online. It's meant for anyone to access it. You can type it in right now on your phone. You can find it. It'll list 32,501 Kenyan objects. That's the name of this exhibition that's up. So they took shipping labels, and the shipping labels each represent one object and tell you small little details taken from the database about the provenance of these materials, right? They know where these materials are, they know how to find them, they know where they're located, but they want to show you the loss. So this art project called 32,501 is already mislabeled. You can't display on a wall 32,501 shipping labels. So there's only 2,000, right, in that sense. But it's a place to see the way that these relationships have maybe fallen apart, relationships haven't been built yet in that sense, and instead display absence. So here are a couple of other slides for it. Again, my source where I've taken these from, an empty museum, right? An empty museum, and that's a powerful place in that sense. It's a museum with zero display cases, printed off materials. These are, again, materials taken from the database. They can be put online because these objects aren't home. These objects aren't coming back or haven't come back yet. And so instead, a place to imagine what it is to make that invisible visible for us, right? This lived active presence, all too often, right? We tend to think of, sometimes the framing of it puts people as if they've already come and gone in that sense, right? This is a common kind of colonial issue for Indigenous people that they've passed on. Right, that they used to exist and now they don't. A reminder of that lived presence is through contemporary artwork. So these are a number of Kenyan artists and some German artists as well, because it's about collaboration and partnership. So they've come through, they've taken some of the objects and made lived art with them. And so you display the art, you don't display the objects. The objects are out of sight. The objects are not in Nairobi to be displayed. And so instead we have these invisible glass cases in that sense, giving us that framed kind of active work about the legacy of loss, the lived presence, and also the future collaboration that can exist. Let's move to Hawaii. Let's all move to Hawaii. One of the really great places about this is something that I actually know a bit more about and feel maybe more comfortable talking about this, but again, this is not my people. This is not my culture to talk about it. But I am a researcher of ancestral remains in museum collections. I've written a lot about these ideas that current guiding policies, now of course guiding policies are not monolith as well. Everybody has different guiding policies, but if we take them in the abstract, there's certain institutions that have certain systematic flaws in them. Returning ancestors involves navigating really this whole quagmire of different issues, each issue specific not only to the holding institution, but the country in which these are from, because exchanges have to be brokered from government to government, national government to national government in that sense. And the onus is often placed directly on the source community, but they're left out of the policy-making decisions. And so these descendants have to navigate foreign legal channels, often in not their own languages, right? You know, they have to figure out how to create localized public pressure from the outside to move things along. I'm from the United States. We have one of the strongest legal legislative acts around repatriation. It's called NAGPRO, the 1990 Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, a name that just slips right off the tongue. And so one of the things here is that even with this kind of strong legislation, it's still systematically flawed. And so the people need to be able to show that they have some sort of cultural affiliation with the ancestors, which they're trying to bring home. And they have to trace this through historical records. But of course, historical records are not preserved in that sense. We don't preserve the names of the collected. We preserve the names of the collectors in that sense. So it's already obscured for them, right? It's beyond an uphill battle, and it's an intentionally obscured pathway for them. Right, American colonialism was one of severing connections between bands and groups and nations. It's a way of erasing sovereign identity, right? So Native America has different sovereignty than the United States in that sense. Canada, same sort of situation. You have First Nation areas. When you want to broker an exchange, the Canadian government and the government of that other nation need to meet together, right? So are we recognizing the full sovereignty of these people? If we're not, this law, sorry, to go to the US, this law doesn't work for them in that sense. And so there's really a chance for us to maybe try to make things right, thinking about in terms of the financing behind this, right? Are we expecting these source communities to be able to afford to pay the lawyers to do this, to pay the repatriation, to fly over, get the items, to pay for the ceremonies, to bring them back? Or should we instead think about the plurality that could exist with these relationships, right? To be invited to the ceremony when they come over and then to go back with them and be part of that ceremony, right? Put the two together in that sense. There's a number of museums in Scotland that have been doing this incredibly well. So that's why it's a real pleasure to talk about this today versus when I talk about it in other locations. But just this week, I'm able to talk about it in Belfast because I live in Belfast right now. And one of the great things is the Ulster Museum has just returned 3 iwi kapuna, so the Hawaiian word for ancestral remains, that they found after this renewed search. So a couple of years ago in 2022, they were looking for Kanaka Maui people within their museum collections. They couldn't find all of them. So a delegation came over from Hawaii, reclaimed the ancestors that were there, but knew that they would have to come back at some point. They came back on Monday, and they were able to collect 3 more people and bring them home. The Ulster Museum makes for a really interesting case study in this sense because it's a place of collaboration in its very making. Ulster Museum in Belfast has benefited from the fact that the Northern Irish government was shut down for a number of years, so they existed kind of outside of the oversight of this, and really put together an anti-racism, inclusive, global perspective in how they want to approach their materials. Still not all the way there, but it's a really interesting kind of start in this sense. And so I think it's really interesting to think about the dynamic and the relationship that can exist between a place like Belfast and a place like Big Island in Hawaii. And so one of these things that we can do is actually trace these people. So there's 2 people that were just returned this week, along with 5 mai kapua, or sacred items that were part of this. And we can almost pinpoint the exact location of where these people were taken. We can't pinpoint who these people were. We don't know that. But we can figure out kind of roughly where they were taken from because it's an area that I happen to know. And so there was a Belfast merchant who flew to the, well, sorry, he didn't fly because this is in the 1840s, who traveled to Big Island, and essentially was a grave robber, went into these sacred caves, took out these ancestral bones, brought them home to Belfast, ended up giving them to a museum collection where they then after a long amount of time, moved from collection to collection, and then have now finally moved back in that sense. And so instead, I want to think about this in terms of illustrating good practice. And I want to use Kanaka Maui. So Kanaka Maui is the Native Hawaiian term for Native Hawaiian. And so Kanaka Maui perspectives, right? Thinking in Oleo Hawaii, right? They're the language of Hawaiian. Because these are the terms that these people use, right? And I think we should use their terms when we talk about them to the best of my abilities that I can do. So we're talking about la kapau, right? Or caves, burial caves in that sense. We're talking about where they exist. They exist on the maikai. So in Hawaii, you'll think oceanside or you'll think mountainside when you're walking. So even when people are walking, they'll say on your maikai, meaning like not on your left, but on your ocean side. They came from Big Island on right here on the Komahana. So Komahana is the way that the birds fly. So the birds fly out to sea in the morning and then fly back in the evening. So we're not thinking west, we're thinking right in a new frame, a new understanding of it, on the ocean side of Big Island in a bay called Keilakekua. Keilakekua is where Captain Cook was killed. So it's often called Captain Cook Bay in all of the tourist pamphlets because it's quite hard to say Keilakekua, but we say Keilakekua because because this is the name of the place, right? We use the terms that these people are using themselves. And so we had Gordon Augustus Thomas, who's this Belfast native. He went there in 1840. He donates these materials that he takes to the Belfast National History and Philosophical Society, where they then end up in Ulster Museum and then return home. And the return is possible because of these longer-term relationships that are existing with these multiple actors, right? So National Museums NI, National Museums Northern Ireland, has been working with the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. It's been working with the U.S. Consulate in Belfast, and it's been working with this group, Hui Wikia Kukuama. It's a nonprofit Hawaiian organization guided under this idea of Ola Naa Iwi, right? The bones live. Is their edict, right? So it uses Kanaka Maui cosmology. Native Hawaiians have very strict taboos against disturbing the bodies of the ancestors. And so because of that, they don't actually have a reburial custom, because you wouldn't do that. If you did that, wars would break out, right? It would be this huge traumatic thing. But instead they need, much like the Sápmi, they need to adapt to this new kind of lived scenario in this sense, right? So how can we kind of activate these ideas and create new cultures in that way? And so after the return of the ancestors this week, one of the things that this organization did was it thanked the people of Belfast, in quote, for their time, that you took care of our ancestors, right? So an acknowledgement that these people were watched by you under your organization. So thank you for the time in which you took care of our ancestors. Thank you for having the responsibility to bring them back. We will now return with them and we will replant them in our land. Their bodies will decompose. They will be able to move on their journeys. We will now be able to move on because we are tied to them, right? This is the strings attached idea as well, right? So when these bodies are disrupted, that continues on and it affects multiple ways of being in that sense, right? So to return it is incredibly powerful and it creates a new partnership in that way. And it creates a new way for maybe us to conceptualize these things. I've talked too long. I have to kind of skip my final example a little bit, but Aotearoa. Aotearoa has definitely been on the forefront of repatriation ideas. They've been doing it since the 1970s. It's a really interesting kind of case study in that sense because there's such an active Maori presence in Aotearoa. And so we can look to this for different guidelines, these protocols, these ethics about care and respect to the ancestors in this sense. Right, so they put out all sorts of repatriation guidance, right? There's a way for these museums to maybe develop these proactive policies, seeking maybe assistance and stewardship in the care and their return. We can see that here in the guidelines. Again, a wall of text, pay attention to the A, B, and C down there as well. Right, this idea of fostering a duty of care. Fostering a collection, fostering a collaboration, a collection in our anarchist sense, right? A collective in that way. Building these ongoing kind of robust relationships guided by source communities, not the museum itself. The Te Papa Museum is really interesting in this. It's been given funding for these, right? It's been given the ability to act on behalf of the New Zealand government in this way, right? So there's funding to provide research. There's funding to provide repatriation travel, to provide freight and crating, right? To bring ancestors home in that sense. All of the associated expenses for international and domestic repatriation, but it's specifically forbidden to share any, to pay for any human remains, right? We don't buy bodies. People don't own humans in that sense, right? The money is instead used to foster these exchanges in that sense. And they're developing all sorts of guidelines for us, right? They're not the only ones, right? There's all sorts of handbooks, repatriation ideas, new systems of knowledge, right? Talk is very cheap, but maybe that's not such a bad thing, right? It costs very little to be more inclusive, to frame things more plural, to listen and to learn. In that sense. So I hope that maybe we can start moving a bit more than meeting people halfway and maybe take the onus to move forward. We do that through plural methodologies, which I've been trying to talk about, right, to imagine and seek out maybe potential possibilities. The potential possibilities are what I'm going to listen to today from all of you who are speaking. I'm here to learn from you. I'm here to put these ideas into practice, into my own understanding. I'm here to listen in that way. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the talks.